I've been covering this war closely for a long time now, and in that time I've seen Russia make a lot of mistakes, absorb a lot of embarrassment, and spin a lot of losses into what their state media calls victories. But what's unfolding in Moscow right now? This might genuinely be the most revealing moment of the entire conflict, and most people aren't connecting all the dots. Here's the backdrop. Every year on May 9th, Russia holds its Victory Day parade, a massive choreographed display meant to honor the Soviet victory in World War II. But calling it just a commemoration would be seriously underselling it. This is one of the most politically loaded events in the Russian calendar. Since the Soviet era, Victory Day has functioned as a tool, a way for the Kremlin to reinforce national identity, demonstrate military power, and remind both its own people and the outside world that Russia is a force to be reckoned with. Which is exactly why what's happening this year is so extraordinary, because instead of projecting strength, this year's parade is doing the opposite. And it's not subtle. Let's go through it piece by piece. First, Russia has been pushing for a ceasefire timed around the parade. Read that again. Russia, the country that started this war, the country that has broken every ceasefire it's ever agreed to, is now asking for one, specifically around the window of its biggest national celebration. That alone should tell you something significant has shifted. Countries that are winning wars confidently don't beg for temporary pauses in fighting so they can hold a parade in peace. Second, for the first time since the full-scale invasion began, Russia's Victory Day parade will not feature the long, intimidating columns of tanks and armored vehicles that have always been the visual centerpiece of the event. Now you can explain that away in a couple of different ways. Maybe Russia has taken such heavy equipment losses on the battlefield that they genuinely don't have enough hardware to put on a show. Or maybe they're terrified of what happens if Ukraine strikes that hardware live on camera in the heart of Moscow in front of an audience of millions of Russians who have been told they're winning. Either interpretation is a damning one. There is no spin that makes removing the tanks from the tank parade look like a sign of confidence. Third, the list of foreign dignitaries willing to show up and sit next to Putin this year has reportedly shrunk significantly. High-profile attendance is a big part of what gives this parade its legitimacy as a global flex. And there are even whispers, credible ones, that Putin himself might not appear in the way he typically does. Now, I'll be honest, we'll know more when the day actually comes. But even the fact that this is being discussed tells you how rattled the situation is. And then there's what's happening on the ground in Moscow right now, before the parade has even started. Russia has reimposed mobile internet blackouts across parts of the city. This is a tactic they use specifically to suppress coordination among dissidents. The logic being that if people can't communicate digitally, they can't organize, can't mobilize, can't show up somewhere in numbers. The fact that they're doing this days ahead of the event signals a deep anxiety about internal unrest. Not just a military threat from Ukraine, but the possibility that their own people could become a problem. Think about what that means. Putin is simultaneously worried about a drone coming from the outside and a crowd forming from the inside. And on the drone front, Russia's response has been nothing short of frantic. Air defense systems are being repositioned from across the country and concentrated around Moscow at a scale that hasn't been seen before. On the surface, that might sound reassuring for Russia. But here's the thing. Moscow was already the single most air defense saturated city in the entire country before any of this started. The fact that even that level of protection feels insufficient tells you how seriously Russia is taking the Ukrainian threat. And Ukraine is absolutely aware of this. Ukrainian sources, including officials, have publicly pointed out that moving all this air defense hardware to Moscow creates holes everywhere else. They've essentially said, we see the gaps and we intend to use them. That is not the kind of statement you make unless you're genuinely confident. Earlier in the war, Ukraine played things close to the chest. They didn't announce strikes before they happened. They just executed them. Remember Operation Spiderweb? Nobody saw that coming until it was already done. That's textbook military strategy. You don't tip your hand. But this moment is different. Ukraine is telegraphing its intentions deliberately, not because it's reckless, but because it knows Russia can't do anything about it. Russia is trapped. If they pull air defenses back from Moscow, they're exposed at the parade. If they keep them there, they bleed everywhere else. Ukraine has forced them into a corner and is making sure Russia knows it. Now, why is this year so different from previous victory days during the war? That's actually the key question here. Ukraine has become demonstrably more capable. The Flamingo cruise missiles, which have shown a consistent ability to penetrate Russian airspace and hit targets deep inside Russia, represent a genuinely new threat level. Long-range drone capabilities have expanded dramatically, and there's now real potential that Ukraine could unveil new ballistic missile capabilities. Imagine that happening during the parade. The symbolism alone would be catastrophic for the Kremlin's domestic narrative. Because here's the internal dimension of all this, and it might be the most important part of the story. Russia's economy is fracturing. This isn't just Western analysis, it's being discussed openly inside Russia, including at major economic forums. Putin knows that prolonged economic strain is historically one of the most dangerous forces a government can face, and so for months now, he's been quietly tightening the screws on information flow, cracking down on VPNs, restricting Telegram, reinforcing state media narratives. All of that is the behavior of a leader who is deeply worried about what happens when his people reach their limit. Victory Day is the one day where Russia is supposed to feel proud, unified, invincible. If something goes wrong on that day, if there's an attack, if there's chaos, if the parade looks shambolic, that feeling flips instantly, and the Kremlin cannot afford that flip right now. There's also a darker calculus that Putin has to be running. Victory Day is the one day per year where his location is completely predictable and publicly known. That makes him a target, not just from Ukraine, but potentially from factions within Russia itself. A regime that has accumulated as many enemies as Putin's always has to account for the possibility that someone on the inside is waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Now, the ceasefire situation deserves its own unpacking because it's genuinely bizarre when you look at it closely. Russia didn't negotiate a ceasefire with Ukraine. They just declared one, unilaterally, and called it a humanitarian gesture. Ukraine responded cautiously, and then Russia broke it almost immediately, including by striking a Ukrainian kindergarten. So what was the point? Here's what I think is actually going on. Putin doesn't truly believe Ukraine will hold a ceasefire, largely because he projects his own approach onto everyone else. He assumes Ukraine will strike the parade regardless of any declared ceasefire. So what does declaring a ceasefire first accomplish? It gives him a narrative. If Ukraine does something on May 9th, Putin can frame it not as war, which Russians are already fatigued by, but as a treacherous attack during a peaceful gesture. He can call it terrorism. He can use it to manufacture outrage and rally support at a moment when that support is quietly eroding. But here's the catch. By declaring a ceasefire he had no intention of honoring and immediately violating it himself, he's revealed the whole game. The move was transparent, and when Russia eventually tries to use this framing, if something happens, remember what the setup actually looked like. Every piece of this puzzle, when you step back and look at the whole picture, tells the same story. Russia is not acting like a power that believes it's winning. It's acting like a power that's trying to manage the optics of losing. Moving air defenses, shrinking the parade, shutting down mobile internet, proposing fake ceasefires. These aren't the decisions of a government projecting confidence. These are the decisions of a government trying to control the speed of its own unraveling. Ukraine, meanwhile, is exploiting every single one of these pressure points with a level of strategic sophistication that frankly deserves more credit than it typically gets. Whether anything dramatic happens on May 9th or not, the window that this parade has created, gaps in Russian defenses, distracted Russian leadership, a panicked Kremlin, is an opportunity Ukraine will not waste. Maybe it plays out on the day itself. Maybe it plays out in the days around it. But the moment is there, and Ukraine knows it. Keep watching, not just the parade itself, but everything happening away from the cameras, because that might be exactly where the most consequential moves get made. If this kind of in-depth breakdown is useful to you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's trying to make sense of all this. I'll see you in the next one.